host Victims and Reentry webinar. My name is Suzanne Brown-McBride, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the Justice Center at the Council of State Governments. I'll be as your moderator for today's webinar, which we will be beginning shortly. We're fortunate to have Trudy Gregory, a true expert and friend in the field of victim services, as a presenter for today's webinar. She's with Justice Solutions and has an abundance of knowledge and insight in the role that victims can and should play in offender reentry. I'd like to thank Christy Hurt for coordinating the development of this webinar. After the presentation by Trudy, there will be time for a question and answer session. To ask a question, please type the question into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will do our best to answer all of your questions, but with the considerable number of attendees we're expecting, we may not be able to get through everything. But please feel free to submit them, and we can also try to identify if there's follow-up that we can do. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call the WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. And please understand that there are some technical issues that may not be able to be addressed. For this, we are recording this event, and we'll post it on our website, which is the National Reentry Resource Center.org. Have the webinar posted online later this week. And once it has posted, we'll email you with a link and the recording. Now I'd like to turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Trudy Gregory.
Suzanne, and I want to add my welcome to all of you as well. This is a topic that is of great importance for those of you, particularly who are involved in the implementation or the enhancement of a reentry program in your state. And the training you're going to see is really an amalgam of training that I and my colleagues, and Seymour, who is a colleague at Justice Solutions and also a national consultant, and a number of others who have been looking at this issue of the victim's role and opportunities that can be addressed through the reentry process to make it a more effective process. We've really been given that clarion call that victims and survivors are a critical component of the reentry process in all its phases, from the time of the offender's sentencing and entry into corrections, pre-entry that begins with classification and continues through programming and reentry planning, and all the way up to that ultimate reentry into the community under supervision. We're going to talk about roles that victims can have, it provided opportunities, and victims' rights and needs that should be addressed by the reentry process. I want to start with a quote from a colleague in Corrections-Based Victim Services, Peter Michaud, who is Director of Victim Services with the New Hampshire Department of Correction. And a few years ago, he wrote an article for Corrections Today about victims and reentry, and he restarted it out by saying, we have a justice system because someone has been hurt by a crime. We need to take into account the harm that's been done to a victim and help that hurt. And to be truly effective in our criminal justice effort, we have to include the fact that a crime has harmed someone. And I think that's really where we have to start with looking at offender reentry. And how can we ensure that victims, survivors, and victim services are being included in what we're doing in the reentry process? Because we're going to talk about the fact that it can have absolutely a benefit for victims, but it can have benefits for offenders as well. When we look at traditional offender reentry, in general, offender reentry has focused on the offenders, and that is logical. What we are proposing is that reentry programs can be victim-centered and offender-focused at the same time. And we're going to look at aspects of that in the presentation today. You know, traditional offender reentry has a lack of attention to victims' needs or concerns or even the rights that exist in jurisdictions where the victims' offenders were preparing to reenter the community. But what we've learned over the last 30 years of working with victims And certainly the last 20 years in corrections working with victims, we've learned that reentry can be a trauma trigger for many victims. The fact that reentry back into the community brings back a lot of oftentimes unresolved trauma impacts for the victim. And so making sure that they are aware of resources and services that exist in the community already for them is a critical part of the information that we can provide, as well as the initial notification that this reentry is about to happen. And we're going to discuss that more. And certainly the fact that it can be a trauma trigger is something that we need to be training professionals who are involved in a reentry about why this is true. A quote I want to share with you is from Reginald Wilkinson, who is the retired director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, but he's also a past president of the American Correctional Association and was one of the real early leaders in planning for effective reentry. And even while he was president of ACA, led an initiative to publish a collection of promising and best practices around reentry initiatives. But what he has said is that corrections needs a culture change. The word is not out there yet that victims need to be considered at the time of offender release. And I think he would even take that further to say not just considered, but we need to be included in our strategic planning for our reentry programs and the implementation of reentry programs, ways that we can address the rights and needs and concerns of crime victims. Take us for a few minutes into a reentry case study. Now, this particular case study is really based on the facts of an actual South Carolina case. And if you were to use this in training, there's actually a video that has been produced by the National Sheriff's Association, supporting the Office for Victims of Crime in the Department of Justice, and can be ordered from the OVC Resource Center, and that phone number is 800-851-3420. And there is a video segment that presents the family talking about this situation and the impact it had on them, and can be used in training. But the situation is a man is convicted of sexual assault of a 10-year-old and evicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Served 7 years, and he's now up for parole. And during incarceration, he attended 9 months of both sex offender and substance abuse treatment programs, but he's not yet fulfilled his restitution order to pay for his victim's counseling costs. This is a pretty typical kind of case, I think, for certainly for child sex offenders. It was one of the more difficult type of offenders when we are doing reentry planning. But think with me for just a few minutes what might be some of the major concerns of the victim and the victim's family when they find out that this offender is reentering the community. The victim is now 17 years old. Certainly, he and his family are going to want to know, what community is the offender being released to. We don't know exactly what the relationship is. Is the offender a family member? Is he a teacher from school, perhaps a coach, someone who lives in the community or in the neighborhood of the victim? So all those things are going to influence the major concerns of the family. But absolutely, they're going to know, when is this offender being released? What community is he being released into? And what is the supervision plan for this offender? Some of the major concerns of the community to which the offender will be paroled, which may be where the crime occurred. Certainly, most of you have dealt with these kinds of cases, and very often there is a real impact on the community. And they want to know, has this offender received any kind of treatment or any kind of programming? We know from the facts that indeed he did go through 9 months of sex offender treatment and substance abuse treatment, but we aren't sure where in the 7 years he was incarcerated did that occur. Was it closer to release, or was it would be programming in the community that can meet this offender's needs? What kind of contact will be allowed for this offender with other children? So certainly the community is going to have some concerns. In order to address those concerns, what are conditions of supervision that might need to be in place, both to address the concerns of the family and safety of the victim, but also to address the concerns of the community and the safety of any future victims that might be in the community. So thinking about what might be the effective conditions of supervision. Are services and support in the community for the victim right now? So we want to ensure that we are giving referrals again to the victim, even though it's 7 years later, that might help assist with emotional concerns that the victim and the victim's family might have upon release. And then who should be involved in this reentry process? Who are part of the planning other than the supervision officers while the offender is incarcerated, and supervision officers that will be in the community? Are there others who need to be involved in this reentry process? Thinking from the victim perspective, there very well might be. Several of my colleagues, Ann Seymour, who I mentioned earlier, and Karen Ho, who is the director of the Office of Victim Services in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, is also the president of the National Association of Victim Service Professionals in Corrections. Several years ago, we were at one of the first national conferences on reentry, and we were going to do a presentation on victims and reentry. Our presentation was near the end of the 2-day conference, so we had the opportunity to hear all the other speakers. And in all the notes that we took, almost every speaker talked about these very real challenges for ex-offenders upon reentry. The fact that there's a stigma, addressing sustenance needs, definitely, how employment is going to be achieved, and the subsequent financial issues around that. Mental health issues or alcohol substance abuse issues, need for peer support, certainly family reunification issues. And as we were writing all of these challenges down, what occurred to us, like a light bulb went off, that these are the same challenges that exist for victims when we talk about their victimization experience, the challenges that they face, not just right after the crime, but for many victims, these are challenges that follow them through not only the next few years, but very often well into the rest of their life. And so these are the kinds of issues when we're doing our strategic planning for our reentry programs and we're thinking about that victim component, we need to remember to look for the services and the assistance that's available in the community for victims that can help them with these issues. And just at the time of the crime, but also an offender is released back into the community, because remember, it can be a trauma trigger, and we need to ensure that victims have those referrals to programs in the community. From the last 30 years of working with victims and the last 20 years of working with victims in the corrections process, that the major needs of victims from the justice system are first and foremost acknowledgement that they are the one who has been harmed by crime, and they have a right to receive information, services, and to have knowledge of what's happening both with the case and with the offender who was involved in that situation. To be treated with respect as that one who has been harmed and as someone who can provide information to the justice system that can actually help with programming and with meeting whatever needs the offender has to ensure success during the entry process, and then absolutely information. Because victims can have all rights in your jurisdiction possible, they are never informed that they have rights. If they're informed of the opportunities that they have a right to take advantage of, to provide input or to be involved in the system, then actually they don't have rights. So major needs are to be acknowledged, to be treated with respect, and to receive all the information that they can. When we look at basic victims' rights, and all 50 states and District of Columbia and all the territories have rights on the books for victims. Some are state constitutionally protected, some are provided through statutory means. But when we look at basic victims' rights, and we would say there are 7 core victims' rights, some states provide up to 12 rights for victims. Of those rights, the 5 that are especially related to reentry are first and foremost notification. We call that the threshold right for victims, that they have notification of information that can be vital to them. And specifically when we're looking at reentry, what's the date of the reentry of the offender, what's the community that the offender is going to be coming back into, what will be the supervision plan for that offender, and what opportunities they have to be involved in that process. Protection would be the second, and protection is really addressed through find what are the safety concerns of a victim for an offender who is reentering the community, and providing response to those safety concerns, perhaps through special conditions of supervision or through ensuring that they have referrals to services and assistance in the community. The third is participation and input. Having opportunities for participation and input is critical for victims. Not every victim will take advantage of those opportunities. They have rights for participation and input. And their input can be very valuable because most victims know their offender, and most victims know their offender very well. So they have information that can really help in the case management and case supervision plan. So having opportunities to provide that is very important. Certainly restitution is one of the rights that relate to reentry, and absolutely information and referrals. Information about the process, about how the offender will be supervised, and referrals to where they can go if they have concerns, or what are the services available for them in the community. When we involve victims in reentry, the first goal is making sure that we have assessed and addressed crime victims' needs. And very often we can get information about that from the victim impact statement that was presented at the time of sentencing, certainly by contacting the victim. Partnering with victim services to do that is a great idea, so that you can assess and address what are crime victims' needs. Inviting victims and service providers to the planning and implementation table when you are set out what your reentry initiative is going to be. And if they've not been at the table so far, it's never too late to extend that invitation to invite them to be a part of planning and the process. Developing creative approaches that can implement victims' basic rights. And very often the creativity comes when you are working in collaboration with state and local victim service organizations can really be partners in ensuring that victims' basic rights are being met and observed, and knowing what those rights are in your jurisdiction is critical, particularly the rights that relate to corrections. Developing approaches for victim offender programming that can focus on offender accountability. And incarceration period is one of the best times to ensure that these types of programmings are being put into place, because that can help ensure the offender's knowledge about the impact of victimization. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some research that has shown that victim offender programming can increase offender accountability through the reentry process. Remembering that when we are looking at victims in reentry, that they should have a role and an opportunity, but no responsibility. It is not their responsibility to be involved, but they should have that opportunity. Opportunities for involvement should always be voluntary for crime victims in the reentry process. Certain victim safety should be a priority, both in reentry planning and in the actual reentry of an offender to the community, and thinking about the direct victim safety, but also any potential victim safety in the community. And how are we going to ensure that that occurs becomes a real critical part of the reentry process. We should not, as corrections professionals or professionals involved in reentry, make assumptions about crime victims. Every crime victim is unique, and we should be sure that that's why we want to involve victims in the process. So we are not making assumptions about their needs. Those needs can best be met, but we are including victims in the process to help us put policies and procedures in place that can be most effective for them. Then remembering that involving victims in the process in a meaningful way is an opportunity, not an obligation. And over the years, we've had a number of justice professionals who said that they had that light bulb moment themselves because they very often had seen victims' rights, and having to observe victims' rights was just an obligation, that they had to do this, until they had that one moment, that one case, where working with the victim gave them so much more information about the offender that they had never read in a police file, they had never read in transcripts from court, they had certainly not heard from the offender in any interviews. Information from the victim, who that offender, provide information that really helped enhance the supervision planning, the offender programming that was involved, and really helped to make the process more effective for the offender as well as for the victim. Think back to some of the early federal initiatives around reentry, and we think back to 2002, where the Federal Serious and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative Program, a collective federal effort that funded 69 grantee sites to develop new or expansion of existing programs around reentry. Those were 3-year grants, and each one of those grantees were required to address victims' needs and rights in 2 areas: victim notification and the principles of restorative justice. All of us learned a great deal from those early SVORI programs and the projects that evolved out of that around victim notification and how through restorative justice to make it meaningful to victims. Now, when we come to the Federal Second Chance Act, many of you probably have funded programs through the Second Chance funding. You're very well aware that the requirements vis-a-vis victims were even greater for the Second Chance funding than it was for the SVORI funding, because now Second Chance funded programs, they are required to provide victim-appropriate services to encourage timely and complete payment of restitution to victims, to services such as security and counseling to victims upon release of offenders. Now, understand those things can also be achieved by collaborating with victim services that already exist, both in corrections and in the community. Protecting communities against dangerous offenders by using validated risk assessment tools. Also, coordination with victim services in development of the reentry strategic plan. So, the Second Chance Act requirements intended for victims and victim services to be involved at the beginning as in the implementation of these programs. And the grantees who receive funding have to provide extensive evidence of collaboration with state and local government agencies who oversee victim services in their state, but also submit annual reports that indicate increased victim participation. So you had to have included performance measures and outcomes measures that are going to be looking at victim participation, and how are you going to show that increase? How are you going to be collaborating? And one of the things I really like about the National Reentry Resource Center logo that you see at the bottom of each of these slides are those interwoven threads, that really talk about the collaboration that's necessary, the working together, the weaving all these parts together to ensure that victims' rights and participation being included in the reentry process. That really brings us to what are some of the challenges when we look at victims and reentry. The first challenge is, do reentry initiatives have a responsibility to crime victims? I think just the requirements of the Second Chance Act show that that's true. And the fact that every one of your states and jurisdictions have laws that require certain rights be given to victims. So then, what is the responsibility of our reentry programs to ensure that crime victims receive those rights and their needs are addressed? And our second challenge is not to view victims as an obligation, but as an opportunity. Not because it's required by the grant, not because there are laws in our state that tell us we have to do it, but because it's an opportunity to enhance and make more effective the whole reentry process. Then we have to look at those questions of, what's enough? For offenders who have reentered the community, is just making sure they have a job and a place to live, is that going to make an effective reentry process? For victims, is it just giving them information and notification? For community, is it just giving them some basic education and an invitation to get involved in the process? For the system, as always, being required to do a lot with a little. So what enough? We know from having worked around the reentry process in communities for several years now, that one of the first reactions is one that my colleague Ann Seymour, always talks about, that not in my backyard. Most communities, that's their first concern, particularly when they're looking at certain categories of offenders, like sex offenders. They don't want to think about the fact that there are offenders who've reentered their community. Even though we know there are always offenders who've never been identified at all living in their community. And very often this is propelled by some very real fears, because we know what some of the statistics are for some types of offenders. How do we address that? We know that if there's a lack of education, a lack of public awareness, that very often communities are not going to want to be involved. Very often it's because they feel they have no control. The more we can build active participation of communities, and we do that through public awareness, through training, the more it's going to have a major impact on victims as well as offenders. Reentry process is being implemented in our communities and throughout that process. how do reentry programs create a victim focus? The most successful strategies, obviously, are those that involve collaboration, and collaboration among system and community-based programs. System and community-based victim services, system and community-based offender programs, all the programs within our community. The more there's that collaboration, more there's the weaving of the threads in the community together, the more effective the process is going to be. So it's very important for us as correctional professionals who are implementing reentry programs that victims and community members are viewed as key partners for collaboration, that we include them in the planning, we include them in the implementation, and remember that victim and community safety has to be a priority. We have to be addressing that. We have to be talking about that in our communities and with the victims of offenders. One of the ways that the Second Chance Act said that we address that is through offender assessments, because they serve both a classification purpose, certainly as offenders enter the corrections process. They also serve a reentry purpose as offenders are getting ready to come back into the community, because it helps with that planning. It helps with programming and supervision planning while offenders are incarcerated. It helps with supervision planning and reentry planning when offenders are coming back into the community. But risk assessment instruments need to take into consideration victims' rights, victims' concerns, and their needs. Some victim information that can be used in these offenders' assessments can come from pre-sentence investigations that were done in the case, victim impact statements that were presented or submitted to the court, or to corrections post-conviction, contacts with the victim to obtain their input about the offender, about the crime, and about their safety during the offender's incarceration, and then contacts with the victims during the reentry process. And planning for these types of contacts can help ensure that we're addressing not only the victim's needs, but other potential victims' needs. And we can look at it through what's called a So That Change, which is a concept that was developed by Public Information, Inc., and some training that they were doing around performance and outcome measures. And it really says that we assess offender risk and programming needs so that offenders are controlled and appropriate charge programs are provided, that offender behavior changes or has the opportunity to change, so that we reduce the risk for future victimization. And that so that change, which involves these risk assessments, plays a part in our ultimate policy intent and also the degree of influence by the Department of Corrections. But while an offender is incarcerated, but ultimately looking at that reentry into the community, how can we best reduce the risk for future victimization of the direct victim, but also the offender? Now, I mentioned those 5 basic rights for victims throughout reentry. We talk about notification and information, and should include such things as, what's the status of the case? What is the status or location of the offender? What is the victim's opportunity to play a role through the reentry process? Again, making sure they know they have rights and what those rights are. That can easily be done by making sure that we those rights on our web pages, our Department of Corrections or our probation or parole websites, letting them know who is the supervision officer and who can they contact in case of emergency. We're looking at protection. It's making sure that we provide the opportunity with the victim to identify their safety needs, their safety concerns and their perceived safety concerns. But both of those need to be addressed. It can include assistance in safety planning, particularly leading up to the release of the offender back into the community. And doing this in conjunction with local victim services who are trained in safety planning is a real point of collaboration for building a kind of wraparound protection for that victim. Looking to see what special conditions might be necessary, if they include protective orders, and letting the victim know who and how do they contact someone if there's a violation of those protection orders or of supervision conditions. When we get participation and input in reentry, it's making sure we have effective pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements, that we allow victims to have some input into those supervision conditions or community service if that's a part of the reentry, opportunities to interact with the probation or parole officer, both pre-release and post-release if possible, including victim advisory councils, part of our reentry program planning. Many of the states and jurisdictions have included victim advisory councils and have found that to be a real source of good ideas and information when they're doing the victim planning. And then looking at those victim awareness and victim offender kinds of programs. There are some real models out there. There is one victim awareness model that you can find at the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center website, and that's www.ovcttac.org. And it's a tested and victim awareness program. Look at restitution as part of the legal financial obligations, making that a priority as a part of reentry. Giving victims guidance in cases of non-payment. Again, referrals to services that already exist in their community. Opportunities for community service as an alternative to restitution in some situations. And certainly if child support is one of those aspects, making sure that that is being followed and that the victim is being kept up to date about everything that's happening around legal and financial obligations. And of course, restitution is one of those aspects that is more difficult in many cases, but that just means we need to make more effort to address that. And there are a number of model responses that you can find around the country. And then looking at that final right that relates to reentry, information and referrals. Make sure that the victim knows about state crime victim compensation, even if it's after conviction. We can't ever assume that anybody else has told them about this process. Finding supportive victim services in the community. If you don't know what those are in your community, you can go to the Office for Victims of Crime online directory of crime victim services. You can find that on their website at www.ovc.gov, G-O-V. And there you can click on that, enter a jurisdiction or a zip code, and it will print out for you all the crime victim service in that jurisdiction. So it can be a real basis for you to begin to fund crime victim services where you are. And making sure that you can provide referral for assistance to victims to meet their basic needs. Now, all of these things mean that in our entry programs, our agency staff need some specific training to be trained on basic victim trauma and mental health needs and how to speak to victims. This doesn't mean that they become a victim trauma expert. It just provides basic education to improve and make more effective the communication so that they can better understand why many victims react the way they do, and particularly why reentry can be a trauma trigger. Basic training on how victim input can help with offender case planning and management. A number of states have addressed this type of training. Personally, I've been involved in West Virginia in the last several years who trained every parole officer in their state on victims' needs and rights as it relates to reentry. And also the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services trained every single employee of the agency statewide. They divided the state into regions. They had an 8-hour training. They did it 2 days at a time in each region. So half of the office came one day, the next day the other half of the office was there. But everyone from receptionists to line officers to supervisors to the administration of the whole department went through a refresher course for them on victim trauma, health needs, how to speak to victims, and what were the services that existed in their state and communities. So they could do a better job of including and responding to victims' needs in reentry. Making sure that information about victims' most frequently asked questions are available perhaps in brochures, on websites, so that it's a go-to place for victims to get information, and that agency understand what are the victim's rights in your jurisdiction and what are the services that are available for victims at the state and local level. And so that's really basic training that's critical for any agency staff involved in reentry processes. Now, the American Probation and Parole Association and the Office for Victims of Crime in the U.S. Department of Justice collaborated on a reentry project several years ago, recognizing the fact that, again, traditional offender reentry really focused on offenders. How could we become more aware of victims' needs and concerns and rights? And funding was provided by the Office for Victims of Crime. And what the project did, the goal was to really fill some of the gaps on reentry. So there was a national survey, some national focus groups, individual interviews, a national call for promising practices relevant to victims in reentry, and the result was a manual focused both on victims' rights and needs and the role of the community. The victim role in offender reentry, a community response manual. And this particular manual, there's a website there that you can download in PDF format, this whole manual that can really begin to be a guidebook for including victims and victims' needs in your reentry programs. A second program that was funded by the Office for Victims of Crime created a second manual, creating a victim focus, a guide to working with victims during offender reentry. And this particular document can be found on the website of the National Association of Victim Service Providers in Corrections. If you go to the policies section on the website and scroll down, you'll come to publications. You can actually download the APPA manual as well as the second manual that was published by the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center, both of which contain excellent information and ideas for how to go about including victims, survivors, and victim services in your reentry programming. Another resource to look at for around the issues of victims is a document called the 3 R's. It was a white paper that was written by criminal justice, corrections, and victim services professionals, addressed the 3 core tenets that relate to reentry: reparative justice, relationships, that word responsibility again. This 3 R's document, the Victim Impact Statement Resource Package, and other resources for victims in reentry can be found on the website of Justice Solutions, and you see that website listed there. The perspective of this white paper, the 3 R's, was really about how to create an opportunity about offender reentry from a perspective that is victim-centered, family-centered, because very often victims are members of the family. That raises a lot of new issues for reentry planning, and that's harm-centered. Still offender-focused, but centered on these 3 aspects. It encourages leadership and commitment from the whole reentry team to achieving the most effective reentry possible. And it focuses on addressing reentry at pre-entry, the time of sentencing and commitment, which many of your programs have already begun to do. When you're in addressing reparative justice, it's really looking at providing opportunities to hold offenders accountable to make reparations to the community, to their family, and to the victim, and certainly involving all the stakeholders so that in building the capacity to prevent harm from occurring again. It also involves addressing the perceived fear and actual potential for victimization within the community and to the original victim when an offender comes back to the community where the crime occurred. As far as relationships, it acknowledges the fact that most offenders know their victims. That crime is a highly personal thing, and offender's victim, his or her family, and any potential support systems, both need to be identified, should not be isolated, and should be a part of the reentry planning. And so far as responsibility, what is the responsibility of the offender to his or her victim, the offender to the community to the offender, the criminal and juvenile justice system to the community and the victim, and criminal and juvenile justice system responsibility to the offender in a reentry process. And again, there's no responsibility of the victim, but we need to remember they can have a role by providing them with opportunities to be involved. And also, when in looking at restorative community service, that is a part of that reentry process, of that reparative justice, of making reparations, making sure that it is visible, vital, and that it's relevant and meaningful to the community. Become very important to ensure that it's effective, both for the victim, the community, and for the offender. Some promising practices around these types of initiatives and the inclusion of victims in the reentry process. One in Ohio is the Batterers Intervention Program, the PROOF program, where batterers intervention occurs while the offender is incarcerated, with certified batterers intervention programs existing within prisons. That basis is laid before offenders come back into the community, and many other jurisdictions besides Ohio that have begun this type of victim offender programming prior to reentry, but yet still a part of reentry. In Connecticut, the University of New Haven has done research around victim awareness program and victim offender programming. Dr. Mario Gabori there has done a lot of research that has shown, and this research was done as recently as the year 2000 and then 2004 and 2008, has shown that victim awareness program, while an offender is incarcerated, can improve their awareness of the impact of victimization and their accountability upon reentry to things like restitution and other aspects and conditions of supervision that show offender accountability. And those of you who are interested in some of that specific research, I'll be glad to provide references for you, and my email will be at the end of the presentation. Then also victim safety planning. I mentioned this earlier and why it's important for victim safety planning to be a collaborative work between victim service specialists in the community and corrections. Several states have really model programs around victim safety planning. Ohio, Washington State, Vermont, West Virginia. Washington State being one of the first states to introduce this wraparound victim safety planning. And our host, Suzanne, was very much a part of the essential planning and implementation for this program, because at that time she was the executive director of the Washington State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So including those experts in your state to put into place victim safety planning is a wonderful initiative. That particular initiative in Washington State, which has been replicated in other places, for the serious offenders, serious and violent offenders who are coming back into the community, actually, before the offender is released, have a meeting or the opportunity to have a meeting with correctional officials, with community supervision professionals, local enforcement, a victim support person of their choice, as well as others who can be a part of their victim wraparound, providing them information and referrals and give them knowledge about processes before the offender is ever released. They can have questions answered and receive information. That is a model program that has done an exceptional job in Washington State, and all can provide many stories from victims who have contacted them with great appreciation for being given that opportunity to enhance their safety. And again, Vermont, West Virginia, Ohio, the same kinds of stories. I also mentioned before victim advisory councils. Again, Ohio and Washington State Departments of Correction, Pennsylvania, and a number of other states have really relied on their victim advisory councils to give them critical information, both in the planning for reentry, but the actual implementation of reentry. And when situations arise that may go outside of what was expected, the advisory councils, again, can provide some response to that and also be a really good resource for making sure that your reentry programs are as effective as possible. One of the most vital victim components of reentry from everything that we've shared is, of course, addressing victim and community safety. And again, that means not making assumptions, but actually talking to victims about what their safety concerns might be, and then using that information in the supervision planning for conditions of supervision, the need for protective orders, whatever those concerns might be. Providing information to the victim about the process, about who will be supervising, where will the supervision be taking place, and answering their questions becomes a lot of that information can be provided up front by having a page on your website that provides information, that has an FAQ section, having pamphlets that are brochures that you can provide to victims with initial notice of the pending release and reentry of the offender, and then also ensuring that there are opportunities for involvement, that victims are given the opportunity for input, both pre-entry and upon re-entry. They are interviewed or are able to meet with the community supervision officer There's an understanding. So they can provide information, they can have questions answered, and it can provide a real benefit for more effective supervision. So kind of a wrap-up review of some of the things that we've talked about. So some of the elements, and it's all about getting back to basics. None of this is new information. It's just making sure that we are including it in our reentry initiative. So it's seeing victims as an opportunity, not an obligation, because that has a real impact on our attitude. We are contacting victims and when victims contact us. And opportunity is for more information than we would ever be able to find in a case file. Being familiar with victim services in your jurisdiction. Make sure that you're at every opportunity seeking input from victims and survivors. That you're having you built in methods to identify and address key concerns, and that you're educating victim service providers in your state, in your jurisdiction, about reentry initiatives, so that they can be that go-between with the victims. They can do some of the pre-work with victims. They can ensure that they, where they can cooperate and collaborate, they will be more than happy to do that, but they need that outreach from reentry programs to open that door for them to be partners on this. Provide victims with basic information and notification at every critical part of the reentry process. Always thinking safety first. Where you can, making restitution a reality. It's a basic victim's right, and it's also a critical requirement of the second chance funding. Recognizing that most offenders know their victims. That's why the victim's information is so important and vital for effective supervision planning. And then engaging interfaith communities in the area. Often they're already involved for offenders, but involving them for victims as well can help ensure the effectiveness of your whole reentry process. I've just put up my email address, and at any point in time, if I can provide more information, clarification, answer questions, and if you're searching for something or need an answer, and I don't know that answer, I can usually track down where we might can find that answer or lead you to someone or a program or an agency that can provide more information. And I would be happy to do that. Similarly, the National Reentry Resource Center at the Council of State Governments Justice Center is the resource place. It is the go-to place for any questions around reentry. So always that phone number and that website can give you a wealth of information and lead you in the right direction. So I'm now going to turn this back over to Suzanne Brown McBride, and I think she's going to lead you into a question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Trudy. We do have a good number of questions that we're going to try to get through. Some of them, certainly we may not be able to get to all of them, but there are some great ones in here. If you want to add in a question in the hopes that we can get all of them, please feel free to type the question into the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom right of your screen. And so I'll read the questions out and then give G a chance to respond. And so let me start with a good broad one, which was actually one of the last questions that we've gotten so far, which is, how do we prepare those reentering to respond, so those reentering, I think meaning specifically offenders who are reentering, to respond to the concerns of the community and a wide range of victims? Like, what are you talking to those who are actually coming back into the community?
That really builds around a lot of information that's shared with offenders prior to their release. I think, really being honest with offenders about what some of the realities of their reentry might be, that they may not be welcomed with open arms by the whole community, by the fact that communities and community members may be watching them. Particularly if they're going back to the community where the crime occurred, or they're going back to the community where they had lived, grew up, or maybe lived for a long period of time. Members will be watching them, even when they don't know it, just to see, is he or she really ready to be back in the community? And I think that helps them begin to understand, even if had no victim awareness programming, or maybe not even a lot of programming, that their responsibility to the community as a whole. Obviously, the more we can implement victim programming in institutions, that really opens up a wide gamut of looking at the impact of victimization, and that those ripples go far beyond the direct victim, that to friends, their families, and the community as a whole. I think there has to be some discussion with offenders prior to release about the realities of their re-entering the community. I think that can help begin to open their eyes to what some of their responsibility is, and certainly the fact that the offenses, the less violations of conditions of their release, the more they will be trusted in the community, and the more it allies the fears that they, as an offender, are a threat to the community.
That's great. Here's a question that I think is a little bit about crime victims' compensation, which is, I think, a really confusing thing for even a lot of us who've been in the victim services for a long time. And the individual says that, in the state that they're from, a crime victim must apply for their benefits through crime victim compensation within 180 days of the crime, meaning that, if you're talking about 180 days, this certainly wouldn't work at the point of reentry. Is that different in other states, or do you have any advice about how victims might be able to access things like compensation or those kinds of benefits at the point of reentry?
Many states, many jurisdictions have that same type of a time limit for applying for initial compensation. But we also have learned through work with the compensation boards around the state that in special situations, particularly if the victim never knew that compensation was an opportunity for them, that appeal can be made both by justice professionals and victims themselves to the compensation, some states is called victim reparations, to that program. And there can be exceptions made for victims who may have never had any, never applied because they didn't know that compensation was an option. So we do know a number of jurisdictions where exceptions can be made. We also know that in some jurisdictions, if a victim initially made application and perhaps received some assistance, but now it's maybe 8 years later or 9 years later and they've not had assistance in between, at the point of reentry, many times victims may need what we call an inoculation of perhaps counseling, because of the fact that reentry is a trauma trigger. And compensation has covered those therapy or counseling sessions years after the initial application, because we are much more knowledgeable now about the ongoing aspects of victimization and trauma. So even though they receive compensation early on, at the time of reentry, particularly when it comes to counseling, there'll be a reopening of the case. And for those victims who never knew compensation existed, there can be exceptions made.
Great. I think that's a great sort of piece of advice, is to assume that somebody hasn't been enrolled in the program, and just to make sure about that. But even if they haven't, there still might be some opportunities. For the folks for the person that's asked the question, if you want to follow, please make sure to contact the Resource Center, and we can help you get connected to states that are doing that.
Excellent.
So what the querent referred to a who question, which is, are some states training reentry staff in victim sensitivity, or are correctional counselors and parole agents a part of victim notification in some states? Essentially, who is the victim services person in a lot of the examples that you're raising, Trudy?
The victim service professionals I see as really coming from two different places. There are the system-based victim service professionals who are already a part of your correctional agency, whether it's a Department of Corrections, a probation agency, a parole agency, AG's offices, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement departments, sheriff's offices. Most system-based justice agencies, I've said didn't say very well, but most criminal justice agencies have a victim services unit. Even if that unit is one or two people, and even if those one or two people, it's a collateral duty and they're not full-time on victim services, almost every justice agency has someone who has been assigned the responsibility of victim services notification. That's a real starting point. But that office or unit within your agency should really be collaborating with city-based programs outside of corrections, and should be absolutely collaborating with the community-based programs like community sexual assault programs, domestic violence programs, child advocacy centers, all types of homicide survivor services, all types of victim services that already exist in your community. And many of them are very open, whether it's the community level or the state level programs. Your state coalitions, criminal justice victim services is very often centered in the Attorney General's office, or perhaps in the Prosecutors Association, or one of the law enforcement state councils or agencies. All of them are very capable of providing training on victim services, on victims' trauma, to those who are involved in reentry processes. So those are the real go-to people for collaboration, around training, around being a part of initiatives, and in being liaisons with victims as well.
Here's a question I have heard a lot of times. This program is asking, their focus of their program is on reentering offenders, and they said, understanding the effect that an offender's have on a victim can be a major part of an offender's recovery and their process of reentering. Is it appropriate to use a surrogate or somebody, to step in for a victim to sort of accomplish this idea of accountability without actually having to involve the actual victim? Another way of asking the question is, so say an actual victim doesn't want to participate, like you were talking about earlier. Is there a way of using either other crime victims or other surrogates or somebody to help, drive home this idea of accountability in a way that's appropriate for offenders?
Absolutely. And most of the victim offender programming and victim awareness programming that exists already in jurisdictions around the country rely a lot on using surrogate victims, both as speakers. I mentioned earlier that there's a victim awareness training program that's available through the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. They actually have videoed victims. All the videos are downloadable from the OVC TTAC website with the training, so that you don't have to identify victims to actually come behind the walls to be a part of the programming. A lot of victim offender programming that, as an ultimate part of the programming, calls for the offender their accountability to write a letter to their victim. That raises the issue of then those letters get actually delivered to the victim. What is the most effective, and what many of the programs do, is they let the victim know that this letter has been written, that it's on file, and the victim has the opportunity, either now or any time in the future, to receive a copy of that letter. But if they don't, the process is important for the accountability aspects of the offenders. Absolutely, using surrogates are procedures that can allow for the offender to express their regrets about what happened, apology, if you want to call it that. But looking at their accountability and admitting their accountability is an important part of preparing for reentry. The person who had questions absolutely right. And yes, using surrogates and methods to address that without the direct victim has still shown to be effective.
And often there are, for some victims that don't want to be involved, they certainly shouldn't be. But there are other victims who actually want to get quite involved and may actually be, willing, stand-ins or willing folks to sit in on, sometimes peer groups I've seen happen, or different mentoring sessions and things like that. So, you may find that there are some victims that are not the individuals that you're working with, their particular victim, but there may be folks who would be willing to share and do that work.
Absolutely.
The question is, so why aren't prisons incorporating victim education for those folks while incarcerated? Shouldn't this also be a responsibility of the prison? And part of the answer here is probably there are some victim programs happening in prison. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, Trudy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned the organization earlier, the National Association of Victim Service Professionals in Corrections. And they actually, at their national conference every year, have a whole pre-day conference on victim offender programming. And it's really looking at what is happening in all the states, what are we learning, what should be, and what are some of the best practices. And their website talks a lot about these kinds of things as well. But yes, there are a number of correctional systems that already have implemented victim awareness programming as well as other types of victim offender programming, and have really developed some best practices. And we have begun to, as I said, really kind of alluded to earlier, we've actually begun to do some research. They've been around long enough to do some research that shows the effectiveness of these programs, so they can actually be called evidence-based programs. And there are many jurisdictions that have this type of resource. And National Reentry Resource Center as well as NAVSPIC are two places you can go to find out where they exist, what type of programming are they using, and how you can get more information.
Another individual asked a question around sort of just trying to think about who your client is. The question is if you're running a reentry program for ex-offenders, isn't it a conflict of interest to work also with victims? How would you work with both of those populations?
I think when you're addressing the rights of victims, the needs of victims, the needs of offenders, I don't see the conflict. Now, if you're providing counseling or therapy for both of those parts of the spectrum, then I think that's when you get into more conflict. I think providing referrals for services to either the offender or the victim is not a conflict. Identifying their needs is not a conflict. But absolutely, I think the more that you as a program can collaborate with community programs whose main purpose is to work with victims, and you can refer to them and work with them, the more you are avoiding the conflict but addressing the needs of victims while you are working more on the needs of the offender. So I think that's where the collaboration becomes critical in addressing the needs of this. And you can still be victim-centered even if you're offender-focused.
I think it just would add for my piece of that that I think most of the time when we're talking about sort of victim services happen in the context of reentry, that many of those services directly are going to be provided by other agencies.
Right.
You're going to be a rape crisis program or a mental health provider or a support group program or perhaps even a law enforcement agency that's helping enforce a protective order. And that the role for the program that's focusing on the needs of an offender coming out of prison is going to be really focused on how do you collaborate between the two, like Trudy was just saying. I can say as somebody who worked in the rape crisis field for a long time, while I certainly was well connected to the treatment providers and supervisors and other folks that worked with sex offenders, I didn't see myself as working with them directly. And so I think it's kind of the same sort of relationship that those that are thinking about helping an individual reenter into the community is going to be thinking about their needs and then how that balances with the collaborative relationships with those victim service providers. Now that being said, there are some agencies that have managed to kind of create enough of a wall between how they do their service programs, perhaps some sorts of mental health agencies where they may see victim and offender populations, but oftentimes they're quite careful about making sure that victims and their offenders are not in the same program, like that they wouldn't accept both of those individuals. So may have sites that are differently located, different staff working on them, that there would be not necessarily information sharing going on between unless that had already been agreed upon and appropriate releases of information were in place. So there are some ways that programs navigate that, but I think it's rare, and when it's done very thoughtfully. So it's not just simply a matter of a victim service program saying, hey, I'm going to work with both of them, or an offender reentry program saying, hey, we're providing services for everybody. It's a matter of sort of collaborating with those specialty providers that are working on each of those issues.
Exactly, and then I think a great example of what you just described is in the state of Connecticut when they have sex offenders who come back into the community. They have their sex offender supervision team includes a community-based victim service provider who works closely with those members of the team who are working specifically with the offender, but their part of the team is to work with the victim, and they all work together to ensure that both the offender and the victim are getting their needs met.
Absolutely. So one of our questions asked, where do I find out about what training is going on in my state department of Queens, or what training is being offered? Is there any central resources that you're aware of, Trudy, to help people sense of what training and what information is being passed around state to state?
In their own department, I would, contact whoever the training officer is for their department, perhaps their academy, to find out what kind of victim training is going on in your state. Every state has a state VOCA director, that's Victim of Crime Act monies that come from the federal government into the state to help fund victim services around the state. And they usually know all the victim training and every kind of victimization that's going on in their state. Now, the state VOCA administrator might be housed in your Attorney General's office, may be housed in your grant funding arm of your state government, but that's a real go-to place for finding out about victim training in the state of all kinds. In your department, I would contact the officer is. Two other places to go nationally, as I mentioned before, the NAVSPIC, the National Association of Victim Service Providers in Professionals in Corrections. Their website, documents training opportunities specific to victim services in corrections, and then the Office for Victims of Crime, also their Training and Technical Assistance Center tracks training that's going on around the country on all types of topics, including victim services of all types and victim services in corrections.
Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure I ask this question because the querent actually asked it twice, two different ways at two different times. So I'm going to reward the poking, which is that there's a requirement to provide these victim services. You mentioned the Second Chance Act and a variety of these other sort of pieces of legislation. There doesn't seem to be any money connected to this. Isn't that sort of a challenge of working in this environment where the good news is that things like the Second Chance Act and a variety of other pieces of legislation have pulled together at least a little bit of money for this issue, but it doesn't seem like similar funds have been sort of pooled together to match for victims.
Well, that is a concern nationally, and I will say those of you who are familiar with Victim of Crime Act money, that it streams into the states through the Office for Victims of Crime, but it's money that is collected off of fees, fines, and assessments on federal offenders in federal court. But this money is distributed nationally to help fund victim services. And the original VOCA Act said money could only be used for victim services, and had a caveat that if the victim was incarcerated, then it could not be used. So there was this real confusion under original law about whether that money could be used to fund corrections-based victim services. Some states said it could, and some states said it couldn't. But currently, the Office for Victims of Crime is rewriting the sections of the VOCA law, and it will be addressed to allow VOCA money in your state to fund corrections-based victim services, which would also fund reentry initiatives, the victim aspects of reentry initiatives. So that's one. Now, it's not here right now, but that's in the future. But, sitting down or contacting your state VOCA administrator, some states already see this, the funding of correctional initiatives around victims, as a part of VOCA funding. So, into that, as well as some of the funding sources that are traditional for Midway or perhaps some other types of community-based funding when you're doing a community-based reentry project.
I ask you a question that it is so challenging and an issue that I think we all have time making sure gets the type of time that it needs. Let's talk about juvenile offenders for a second. Are any of the sort of the you discussed or the methods, or are there any good ideas around what should we do around helping juvenile offenders understand their impact on victims? And is there that would qualify as at least promising in terms of your experience?
Now, the victim awareness programming that familiar with, and that is the model for what's done in most states, started with juvenile offenders. So there is a long history of victim awareness training programming for juvenile offenders while they are being supervised in institutions and facilities. It has been researched and has shown some success in that area. I say that not all states' victims' rights laws apply to victims of juvenile offenders. So areas that in the victim rights field that we have been addressing and looking at. But in most states, those victims' rights, a victim's rights are not contingent on the age of their offender. So absolutely we need to begin to address, when we're looking at entry, we're looking at offender accountability, whether that offender is a juvenile, whether or an adult. The impact on the victim is the same, regardless of the age of the offender. So how can we begin to address these same concerns for juveniles? And most of everything presented in this presentation are applicable to juveniles as well as adult offenders.
Fantastic. And with that, I'm sorry for those of you that we've not been able to get to your questions. For a couple of you who were asking issues like to repeat some websites or to ask about which practices are considered evidence-based, I would really encourage you, once we are able to send out the slides for this presentation, to follow up on the just amazing pile of resources that Judy gave you throughout this talk, and I think it will be able to answer some of those questions. This concludes the Victims and Reentries webinar. This webinar was made possible with funding and support from the U.S. Department of Justice, Justice Assistance. For your attendance and participation, and thank you to Trudy. I really appreciate your time today. When you log off today, you will be shown a brief survey. We would really encourage you to spend a couple minutes in telling us what you thought of this presentation, and if there are things that you'd like us to continue to think about in the future as we're trying to talk to reentry practitioners. We'll be emailing you a link to the recording of this presentation in the next few days. The link will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center website, which is reentryresourcecenter.org. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attendance.